Hello, guys. We continue with chapter 5 of the book, What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20. It's the second half of the chapter that is called The Secret Sauce of Silicon Valley. These stories highlight an important point. A successful career is not a straight line, but a wave with ups and downs. Michael Deering describes this wonderfully with a simple graph that maps a typical career with time on the x-axis and success on the y-axis. Most people feel as though they should be constantly progressing up and to the right, moving along a straight success line. But this is both unrealistic and limiting. In reality, when you look closely at the graph for most successful people, there are always ups and downs. When viewed over a longer period of time, however, the line generally moves up and to the right. When you're in a down cycle, it's sometimes hard to see that the temporary dip is actually a setup for the next rise. In fact, the slope of the upward line is often steeper after a down cycle, meaning you're really achieving more than if you had stayed on a steady, predictable path. Carl Bartz, the former CEO of Autodesk and new CEO of Yahoo, uses another great analogy to describe a successful career path. She thinks you should look at the progress of your career as moving around and up a three-dimensional pyramid, as opposed to up a two-dimensional ladder. Lateral moves along the side of the pyramid often allow you to build the base of your experience. It may not look as though you're moving up quickly, but you're gathering a foundation of skills and experiences that will prove extremely valuable later. One of my favorite stories about the cyclical and unpredictable nature of careers comes from Steve Jobs. As the founder of Apple and Pixar, his success stories are legendary. However, many of his finest successes grew out of failures. He described these stories beautifully when he gave the commencement address at Stanford in 2005. Here is an excerpt of his speech. We had just realized our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I had just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. And for the first year or so, things went well. But then our vision of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a failing out. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. So at 30, I was out. And very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I really didn't know what to do for a few months. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton as it was being passed to me. I met with David Packard and Bob Noyce and tried to apologize for screwing up so badly. I was a very public failure, and I even thought about running away from the valley. But something slowly began to dawn on me. I still loved what I did. The turn of events at Apple had not changed that one bit. I had been rejected, but I was still in love, and so I decided to start all over again. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. Less sure about everything, it freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. During the next 5 years, I started a company named Next, another company named Pixar, and fell in love with an amazing woman who would become my wife. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer-animated feature film, Toy Story, and is now the most successful animation studio in the world. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next. I returned to Apple, and the technology we developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And Lorraine and I have a wonderful family together. I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. Sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick. This story is echoed time and time again. Essentially, most individuals' paths are riddled with small and enormous failures. The key is being able to recover from them. For most successful people, the bottom is lined with rubber as opposed to concrete. When they hit bottom, they sink in for a bit and then bounce back, tapping into the energy of the impact to propel them into another opportunity. A great example is David Newman, the founder of Jetblue. David initially started an airline called Morris Air, which grew and prospered, and he sold it to Southwest Airlines for $130 million. He then became an employee of Southwest. After only 5 months, David was fired. He was miserable working for them, and as he says, he was driving them crazy. As part of his contract, he had a 5-year non-compete agreement that prevented him from starting another airline. That seemed like a lifetime to wait, but after taking time to recover from this blow, David decided to spend that time planning for his next airline venture. He thought through all the details of the company, including the corporate values, the complete customer experience, the type of people they would hire, as well as the details of how they would train and compensate their employees. David says that getting fired and having to wait to start another airline was the best thing that ever happened to him. When the non-compete period was over, he was ready to hit the ground running. Just like Steve Jobs, he was able to turn what seemed like a terrible situation into a period of extreme productivity and creativity. Failing, of course, isn't fun. It's much more fun to tell the world about our successes. But failures can serve as incredible opportunities in disguise. They force us to reevaluate our goals and priorities and often propel us forward much faster than continued success. Getting too comfortable with failure, however, seems risky. Are those who celebrate failure doomed to fail? Imagine corporate employee of the month photos showcasing the biggest screw-ups. However, as Bob Sutton points out in Weird Ideas That Work, rewarding only successes can stifle innovation because it discourages risk-taking. Bob suggests that organizations consider rewarding successes and failures and punishing inaction. Doing so would encourage people to experiment, which is more likely to lead to interesting and unexpected outcomes. I'm not saying that your company should reward people who are stupid, lazy, or incompetent. I mean, you should reward smart failures, not dumb failures. If you want a creative organization, inaction is the worst kind of failure. Creativity results from action rather than inaction, more than anything else. Bob adds that there is strong evidence that the ratio between our individual successes and failures stays the same. Therefore, if you want more successes, you're going to have to be willing to live with more failures. Failure is the flip side of success, and you can't have one without the other. At the D School, there is a lot of emphasis on taking big risks to earn big rewards. Students are encouraged to think really big, even if there's a significant chance that a project won't be successful. To encourage this, we reward spectacular disasters. Students are told that it is much better to have a flaming failure than a so-so success. Jim Plummer, the dean of Stanford's School of Engineering, embraces this philosophy. He tells his PhD students that they should pick a thesis project that has a 20% chance of success. Some students find this discouraging, interpreting this to mean that they will have to do 5 different projects before they reach completion. Quite the contrary. The experiments should be designed so that a failure is informative and a success leads to a major breakthrough. Doing small incremental experiments with predictable results is much less valuable than taking a big risk that will potentially lead to a much bigger reward. The flip side of being comfortable with failure and walking away from a project that doesn't work is the risk of quitting too early. Take the classic story of 3M's Post-it notes, which began with an adhesive that didn't stick and turned into a multi-billion-dollar business. In 1968, Spencer Silver invented this low-tech adhesive and promoted it internally at 3M. But initially, no one was interested. It wasn't until 1974 that a colleague, Art Fry, realized he could use the substandard glue to keep bookmarks in place in his church hymnal and spend his free time designing the product we know now as Post-its. It wasn't until 6 years later that 3M launched the product across the United States. Today, they sell more than 600 posted products in more than 100 countries. Imagine the lost opportunity of the engineers at 3M hadn't realized the potential in this failed product. This mindset is captured in the class project discussed earlier, where teams turn bad ideas into great ideas. We often live on the edge of success and failure, and it is rarely clear which way we will land. This uncertainty is amplified in high-risk ventures such as restaurants, technology startups, and even sports, where the line between success and failure may be razor thin. Consider the Tour de France. Even after days of cycling up and down steep and winding mountains, the time difference between the winners and the losers boils down to a matter of seconds, if not milliseconds. Sometimes a little extra push is all it takes to flip the switch from failure to success. Some companies have mastered the ability to coax the value from products that others might discard as failures. Marissa Mayer, who leads product development at Google, says it is important not to kill projects too early, but to morph them instead. That is, figure out what part is working well and what needs to be improved instead of discarding it. Marissa believes that there is usually a way to extract some value from any project, even one that doesn't seem to be working. Google and other web companies rely on A to B testing. That is, they release 2 versions of the software at the same time and receive quick feedback on what approach is more successful. These companies find that by making small modifications, such as changing the color of a button, adding a single word to a message, or moving images around the page, they can dramatically alter a customer's response. Some web-based businesses release dozens of versions of the same product a day, each altering the user experience in some small way so that they can evaluate the response. A company founded by 2 former Stanford students, Jeff Zybert and Kimber Lockhart, uses this approach all the time. GetBackboard.com is a website for collecting feedback on documents. They continue to experiment with different calls to action on their website and keep track of which approach works best. When they had a green bubble that said, "Get an account today," they had an 8% sign-up rate. When the message was changed to "Easy Quick Sign Up," the response rate increased to 11%. And when the text offered a free 30-day trial, the response jumped to 14%. This type of experimentation turns failures into successes and makes successes more successful. Trying new things requires a willingness to take risks. However, risk-taking is not binary. I'd bet that you're comfortable taking some types of risks and find other types quite uncomfortable. You might not even see the risks that are comfortable for you to take, discounting their riskiness, but are likely to amplify the risk of things that make you more anxious. For example, you might love flying down a ski slope at lightning speed or jumping out of airplanes and don't view these activities as risky. If so, you're blind to the fact that you're taking on significant physical risk. Others, like me, who are not physical risk takers, would rather zip hot chocolate in the sky lodge or buckle themselves tightly into their airplane seats than strap on a pair of ski boots or a parachute. Alternatively, you might feel perfectly comfortable with social risks, such as giving a speech to a large crowd. This doesn't seem risky at all to me, but others who might be perfectly happy jumping out of a plane would never give a toast at a party. On reflection, there appear to be 5 primary types of risks: physical, social, emotional, financial, and intellectual. For example, I know that I'm comfortable taking social risks, but not physical risks. In short, I will readily start a conversation with a stranger, but please don't ask me to bungee jump off a bridge. I will also happily take intellectual risks that stretch my analytical abilities, but I'm not a big financial risk taker. On a trip to Las Vegas, I would bring only a small amount of cash to make sure I didn't lose too much. I often ask people to map their own risk profile. With only a little bit of reflection, each person knows which types of risks he or she is willing to take. They realize pretty quickly that risk-taking isn't uniform. It's interesting to note that most entrepreneurs don't see themselves as big risk takers. After analyzing the landscape, building a great team, and putting together a detailed plan, they feel as though they have squeezed as much risk out of the venture as they can. In fact, they spend most of their efforts working to reduce the risks for their businesses. Elizabeth Pate Cornell, chair of the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford, is an expert in the field of risk management. She explains that when analyzing a risky situation, it's important to define the possible outcomes and attempt to figure out the chances of each one. Once this is done, one needs to develop a full plan for each eventuality. Elizabeth says it makes sense to take the high-risk, high-reward path if you're willing to live with all the potential consequences. You should fully prepare for the downside and have a backup plan in place. I encourage you to read the last few sentences several times. Let me read it several times. Elizabeth says, it makes sense to take the high-risk, high-reward path if you're willing to live with all the potential consequences. You should fully prepare for the downside and have a backup plan in place. Experts in risk management believe you should make decisions based upon the probability of all outcomes, including the best and worst case scenarios, and be willing to take big risks when you are fully prepared for all eventualities. It's also important to remember that good decisions based on an accurate analysis of the risks involved can still lead to bad outcomes. That's because risk is still involved. Here's a simple example. Soon after I got out of school, I was offered a job I wasn't sure was a great fit for me. After several days carefully considering the opportunity, I decided to turn it down, assuming that soon thereafter I would be able to find another job that was a better match. Unfortunately, the economy turned south quite quickly, and I spent months looking for another job. I kicked myself for not taking that position, which started to look more and more appealing. I had made a good decision based upon all the information I had at the time, but in the short run, it wasn't a great outcome. As in this situation, under most circumstances, you have to make decisions with incomplete information. That is, you have to make a choice and take action in the face of considerable uncertainty surrounding each option. So how do you fill in the gaps of your knowledge? I suggest looking to Stanley for inspiration. The inner workings of Stanley, the autonomous vehicle designed and built by Stanford's Artificial Intelligence Lab and Volkswagen Electronics Research Laboratory for the DARPA Grand Challenge, offer clues to decision-making with incomplete information. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is a government agency charged with the development of cutting-edge technology for the military. In the DARPA competition, driverless cars must navigate a 212-kilometer off-road race. Each must pass through 3 narrow tunnels, make more than 100 sharp turns, and navigate mountain passes with steep cliffs on each side. Despite very low odds, Stanford's car won the race due in large part to its ability to make quick decisions with incomplete information. Stanley had a lot of powerful technology on board, included 3-dimensional maps of the terrain, GPS, gyroscopes, accelerometers, video cameras, and sensors on the wheels. The onboard software analyzed and interpreted all incoming data and controlled the vehicle's speed and direction. But the key to Stanley's victory was its superior skill at making decisions with incomplete information. The designers accomplished this by building in the ability to learn the way humans do. They created a database of human decisions that the car drew upon when making judgments about what to do. This data was incorporated into the learning program tied to the car's control system and greatly reduced errors in judgment. This story highlights the fact that learning from others can significantly reduce your failure rate. You don't have to figure everything out yourself. Like Stanley, you should gather all the data you can from your environment and then tap into the wisdom of those who have gone before you in order to make the best possible choice. All you need to do is look around to see hundreds, if not thousands, of role models for every choice you plan to make. If you do take a risk and happen to fail, remember that you personally are not a failure. The failure is external. This perspective will allow you to get up and try again and again. Your idea might have been poor, the timing might have been off, or you might not have had the necessary resources to succeed. As Jeff Hawkins say, you are not your company, you are not your product. It is really easy to think you are, and it is really easy to get wrapped up in it. But if you fail, or even if you are successful, it is not you. Your company may fail, your product may fail, but you are not the failure. Keep in mind that failure is a natural part of the learning process. If you aren't failing sometimes, then you probably aren't taking enough risks.